Okay, so a forest edge is the interface between forested and non-forested ecosystems, or between two forests of contrasting composition or structure. So we can see in this photograph here, there are many different types of forest edges. So we have forests adjacent to different ecosystems. So those would be the non-forested ecosystems. So we can see here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, hopefully, but we can see forest adjacent to a lake, forest adjacent to a harvested area. We can also see forest adjacent to roads. So this photograph really shows that forest edges are important and they contribute to spatial heterogeneity in landscapes. And by doing that, they also regulate flows of organisms, materials, and nutrients. So there are two main types of forest edges. The first is inherent. And so inherent forest edges just results from differences in characteristics such as topography or microclimate. So you can see in this photograph on the left, this is an inherent forest edge adjacent to a lake. These inherent forest edges tend to be relatively stable and long-term features of landscapes. On the other hand, we have induced forest edges or created forest edges, and these forest edges are created by either natural or anthropogenic disturbances. So on the top here, we have a forest edge that was created by an insect outbreak, a spruce budworm outbreak in northern Cape Breton. And that would be considered an induced edge created by natural phenomenon. On the bottom, we have a photograph of forest edges that were created by activities related to logging. So these forest edges were created for forest harvesting practices. And you can see that the forest edges vary in age. So some of the forest edges here are younger, and some of them are older, so we can see the forest is growing back. So there's a lot to think about when thinking about forest edges, but these are two types of forest edges. They can then further be classified as being maintained or regenerating. So maintained, an example of a maintained forest edge would be this photograph on the left of forest edge adjacent to a hiking trail. Another example would be a forest edge adjacent to a road. So these forest edges tend to be maintained for human use. But that being said, some forest edges are maintained by non-humans as well. So some animal species that browse, such as moose, can actually maintain forest edges by preventing forest regrowth because of their browsing. An alternative to maintain forest edges is regenerating edges. So in this example here, this is a natural forest edge because it was created by an avalanche. And typically what would happen here is the forest would regrow. So this would be considered a regenerating forest edge. So you may have heard the term an edge effect or edge influence, and this occurs when a response variable is significantly different at the forest edge compared to the forest interior. And so this forest interior we think of as being undisturbed by the forest edge. And so if we look at this graph on the left-hand side here, on the x-axis is distance from edge. So the 0 meters would indicate the position of the forest edge. And then as we go into the forest interior, we increase our distance from the edge. So in this case, the forest interior is being represented by 60 meters. And so we can consider the patterns of different response variables at the edge going into the forest interior. So for example, at the top here, in this example, the response variable is actually lower at the forest edge compared to the interior. In the middle case, the response variable is higher at the edge compared to the interior. And this straight line here in the last plot is representing no significant difference. So here we see that that particular response variable, whatever it may be, wasn't actually affected by the forest edge. And so we see that straight line there. But what's interesting to consider is we can actually consider how a response variable at the forest edge is affected by the adjacent area. So in this case, we can actually sample into the adjacent area, whatever that may be. So maybe it's a clear cut or an area that was disturbed by a wildfire. But whatever that adjacent area is, we can sample there too and compare the response variable at the edge to that adjacent area. And now, of course, this there are limitations to this, because if we were sampling a response variable that didn't exist in a water body example, for example, that wouldn't work. But it's just interesting because more studies are incorporating the adjacent area into their sampling and analyses. So then we can try to quantify that edge influence. So if we think about the term distance of edge influence, that's the distance from the edge at which the response variable is significantly different from that forest interior. And so there's a really nice study done on anthropogenic edges that tried to quantify that distance of edge influence for different response variables related to vegetation. So on the x-axis here, we have distance of edge influence, and then there are different response variables represented on the y-axis. And those can be broken down into primary processes, primary structure, and then secondary processes, secondary structure, and secondary composition. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to do a more comprehensive literature review that incorporated natural forest edges in addition to the anthropogenic forest edges. So we completed a literature review in 2020 to identify trends in edge studies over time, determine the types and localities of studied edges, and then also compare findings on edge influence. And so we searched for published journal articles that considered the structure and or composition of vegetation at natural and or anthropogenic edges, because some studies actually incorporate both. They do nice comparisons between natural and anthropogenic edges, and then other studies just consider one or the other. And so for each article, we noted the publication year and the location of the study. And then we looked at the vegetation response variable and classified it as primary. So this would be a direct edge effect, or secondary, and this would be an indirect edge effect. We also classified that vegetation response variable as a process, structure, or composition. And then we noted it as being either higher, lower, or not significantly different at the edge compared to the forest interior. And then some articles did quantify or calculate DEI, so that's the distance of edge influence. And so that would have been noted if the authors had calculated that. And so I'll share some of the results that we found. So we found that 338 studies considered anthropogenic edges. Natural edges weren't as popular, but for the inherent natural edges, we found 89 studies that considered those, and then 19 studies that considered naturally induced forest edges. This graph is showing the number of publications over time. So we have the year of publication on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the number of published studies. And so as we would expect, the number of published studies has gradually increased over time, which is great, although we do still see this discrepancy between anthropogenic and natural edge studies. So there still appears to be a lot more anthropogenic edge studies as opposed to natural edge studies. This map is showing the locations of those edge studies. So we found that edge studies were performed in 55 different countries, which is great. The filled circles are representing anthropogenic edge studies, and then the unfilled circles are representing natural edge studies, and then the stars are actually indicating where studies considered both edge types. So we can see that we have a nice distribution of studies, although there are studies lacking in many places, particularly in Africa and Russia. And for some of these places, we wouldn't expect forest edge studies to occur if they lack forest, but we would hope to see more studies in certain areas such as Russia where we know that there are forests there. So this table is showing the number of studies for the different edge types in the different forest types. So we have a very nice mix of different edge types. We did find the first part of the study the first part of the table is showing natural inherent edges. And then in the middle, we have natural induced edges. And then at the bottom, we have anthropogenic forest edges there. So if we look at this table in greater detail, we can see of the naturally inherent edges, the tree line appears to be the most popular studied edge. If we consider the naturally induced edges, wildfire was the most popular studied edge, and then in anthropogenic forest edges, edges adjacent to harvested areas were the most commonly studied. But we can see that these varied by age. So it was neat to see the different ages because that can affect the vegetation patterns. And then we noticed that in terms of forest type, most of the studies occurred in temperate forests, which is kind of what we would expect. And the studies that occurred in the different different edge types really varied by forest type. So we can see in boreal forests, a lot of the studies occurred at harvested edges, as well as wildfire and insect outbreak edges. And then for tropical forests, pasture edges were especially prevalent. Some edge types only had a single study. And so the ones that are highlighted here, so the barrens, the cliffs, the dunes, and the landslides only had a single study associated with those. And before I move on there, I just, I guess I challenge you to think of an edge type that isn't included in this list. So for example, for natural edges, I don't see avalanche. So there's a lot of potential, and there are a lot of edges out there that just haven't even been studied. So we have very limited data for some edge types. This table is showing the different response variables. So we found 93 different response variables related to vegetation. And it's showing the number of studies that indicated whether that response variable was higher, so that's indicated by the H, lower, indicated by the L, or not significant, indicated by NS in this case. And it's separated by edge type, so anthropogenic, natural induced, and natural inherent. And so we see that typically primary processes were higher at the forest edge compared to the forest interior, whereas primary structure variables, so this would be, for example, the number of live trees or density of live trees, these were lower at the forest edge compared to the forest interior. And then here we're seeing dead trees. So here we're seeing some interesting patterns where at anthropogenic and natural induced edges, so at created edges, there tends to be more dead trees at the edge compared to the forest interior, whereas we see kind of an opposite trend for natural inherent edges where there tend to be fewer dead trees or just no significance there for that response variable. For secondary process, again, we found higher results at the edge compared to the forest interior. And then for secondary structure and secondary composition, it was similar. One thing to note is for non-vascular plants, so this would include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, we found the response to be lower at the edge compared to the forest interior. But as you can see, we're missing a lot of data for natural forest edges. Species diversity in general tended to be higher at the edges compared to the forest interior for all of the different edge types. And then for non-native species, that was also higher at the edge compared to the forest interior. But again, we're lacking a lot of data for natural edges here, so it's hard to make generalizations. Browse damage was the most popular tertiary process that was studied at the edge, and this tended to be higher at the edge compared to the forest interior. So that's what I was talking about before, where these browsing animals can actually start to maintain forest edges, which is pretty neat. So there were 56 studies on 65 edges that actually estimated or quantified the distance of edge influence. So this figure here is showing distance from the edge into the forest interior on the x-axis, and then different response variables on the y-axis. And overall, we see that DEI tended to be lower for primary processes and structures than it did for secondary response variables. So the direct edge effects tended to have a lower DEI than the indirect edge effects. The different colors are representing the different shades of gray, I should say. So the white is representing the natural inherent edge, the gray is representing the natural induced edge, and the black is representing the anthropogenic induced edge. And it's really hard to compare DEI among these different edge types, just because we have we don't have a lot of data. And so as you can see, overstory is the only variable, the only response variable that actually considered all three of these. And in this case, we see that DEI was greater at the anthropogenic edge as compared to both the natural edge types. But it's really hard to make these comparisons with so little data. This graph is showing the distance from edge into the forest interior. So we're having the DEI estimates here again at the different edge types. So this is showing the different forest types. So now the white is representing tropical forest, the gray is representing temperate forest, and the black is representing boreal forest. And it's really hard to make comparisons, but one thing to note is that at the DEI overall estimate for the anthropogenic edge was 42 meters, and this is higher than the DEI reported for the natural edges. So at the natural inherent edge, overall DEI was 25 meters, and at the natural induced edges, the overall DEI was 22 meters. So this is quite a bit lower than the overall estimated DEI at anthropogenic edges. We looked at some other things. So we wanted to compare narrow linear features with larger disturbed areas, thinking that maybe DEI would be lower at narrow linear features. It was marginally lower for anthropogenic forest edges adjacent to those relatively narrow linear corridors. So those would be seismic lines or roads or trails, compared to those adjacent to larger disturbed areas such as clear cuts or larger wildfires. So there was a marginal difference there. Edges adjacent to areas burned by fire ignited by humans actually exhibited greater mean DEI than those adjacent to areas burned by wildfire. But again, our sample sizes were quite low, so it's hard to make generalizations based on these findings here. So when we're considering those responses to edges by vegetation, we really need to consider the mechanisms that are driving those responses. So microclimate can have an effect on the vegetation responses. So for example, if there's increased light availability at the forest edge, this could result in increased sapling density, increased understory cover of shade intolerant species. or decreased cover of light-sensitive lichens and mosses. So for this next part of the presentation, I'm going to show you results from a study that considered both tree regeneration, so that vegetation response, and microclimate at forest edges. So we're trying to kind of study and sample both of those at the same edges to see if we can we can relate these responses together. So this study was done on seismic lines. So these are narrow linear features, and they're created for energy exploration. And they really increase anthropogenic edge density. So you can see in the map here of Alberta, the yellow is representing, the yellow to red is representing the density of seismic lines in the province, and you can see it's quite dramatic. So they're actually the leading cause of forest fragmentation in areas exposed to the oil and gas industry. And they are problematic because they alter habitat use of many, many different species. And we know that woody vegetation recovery rates on these seismic lines are slow. So there are conventional seismic lines that are approximately 5 to 10 meters in width. So photo A on the top here is a photograph of a wide seismic line. And then narrow seismic lines are typically approximately 1.5 to 4 meters in width, so they're narrower. And these are used more recently because we know the effects of these wide seismic lines, they can be quite negative. So this width of the seismic line has been reduced, but that being said, these wide seismic lines are still prominent features. And there's sometimes very, very little forest recovery on these seismic lines. So we wanted to compare the effects of these different seismic line widths on vegetation and microclimate. So as I said, we wanted to compare the abiotic conditions between wide and narrow seismic lines, quantify microclimatic edge effects of seismic lines of different widths and orientations, and then relate patterns in tree regeneration density to local patterns in the abiotic environment. So this is a map of our study area. So we sampled in northeastern Alberta, and the different colors in map B are representing some examples of our sampling sites. So you can see the yellow is representing sample sites for the wide lines, and then the green is representing sample sites from the narrow seismic lines. And then the blue is representing well pads, where we sampled well pads. And the reason we did this was because well pads are also prominent features in areas disturbed by the oil and gas industry. And we wanted to know what the microclimate was like in these large openings. So we wanted to compare the effects of seismic lines on these narrow lines and sample in the interior forest, so where there was a lot of forest canopy cover, but we also wanted to sample in areas with very little canopy cover so that we could see how different the seismic lines are to these larger openings or larger disturbances. So that was the purpose of the well pads. So this is just a breakdown of our study design. So we found both narrow and wide lines that were oriented either east-west or north-south. And then we replicated each of those combinations 6 times. So we had 24 seismic lines that we sampled. And at each seismic line, we created a little microclimatic station. So we set those stations up right in the middle of the seismic line and right at the edge of the seismic line, and then 5 meters, 10 meters, and 25 meters into the adjacent forests. So it would have been nice to go even further into the forest to get a better representation of the forest interior, but it's really difficult to do so because the seismic line network is so tight that once you go further into the forest, you're starting to hit another seismic line. So it's really hard to get a good representation of the forest interior, especially when the conditions are so heterogeneous in these areas. But anyway, this was our sampling design. So we did so we sampled on both sides of the forest edge. So here, this gray area is representing the seismic line, and the green area is representing the adjacent forest. And then in the well pads, we just set up the microclimatic station right in the middle of the well pad. So these stations were left up from June 7th to August 7th in 2018. And at each station, we set up a hobo pendant data logger to record light intensity. And so the light intensity data logger was set up 1.2 meters above the ground, and it recorded light every 5 minutes. And light was recorded in lux. And then we also used eye buttons to record air temperature and relative humidity. And so these were set up 15 centimeters above the ground layer vegetation, and we created a little radiation shield around them to try to mitigate the effects of light. And they recorded air temperature and relative humidity every 15 minutes. And then we kind of had a circular plot around the microclimate sensors, and in that we counted and recorded the number of tree saplings, so they were less than 1.3 meters in height within that area. And so for analyses, we kind of defined edge effect as the distance from the seismic line forest edge at which the response variable was significantly different as compared to that at the 25 meters from the edge. So that was our forest interior in this case. And then we used our software to do mixed effects models and pairwise comparisons to look at our results. And what we found was that for all of the abiotic response variables, there was a significant interaction between the location on the transect and the width of the seismic line. So these are the results for light intensity. So on the x-axis is the distance from edge, with the seismic line center in the middle of the plot. And then on the y-axis is average daily light intensity. And the little orange circles are representing the results from the wide seismic lines, and the green triangles are representing results from the narrow seismic lines. And what we can see is what we would expect is that light intensity was higher in the center of the seismic line compared to the adjacent forest. But what's interesting is that it kind of varied by the orientation of the line. So the plot on the left is showing the seismic line oriented east-west. And we see that on wide seismic lines, light intensity was actually higher at the south-facing edge, so at the north edge, than it was in the middle of the seismic line. And of course, here we see that the edge effects are extending into the forest on the north-south seismic line. So if we look over at the plot on the right-hand side, the seismic line that was oriented north-south, we see that the edge effects are extending 5 meters into the forest here. And again, the light intensity is highest in the middle of the line for the wide seismic lines and the narrow seismic lines here. These are the results for air temperature. So here what we're seeing on the top is air temperature during the day. And then on the bottom, we're seeing air temperature at night. And those gray bars in the plots are representing the results from the well pads. And what we see here is that, again, this strong effect on the south-facing edges. So if we look, the daytime temperatures were higher at the edges compared to the forest interior and compared to the seismic line center. We're even seeing that on east-facing wet edges during the day. We see these higher temperatures at the edge compared to the seismic line centers and forest interiors. And then at night, we kind of see a reverse pattern where the temperatures are lower at the edge and in the seismic line centers as compared to the forest interior. And these edge effects are extending off of the seismic line into the forest. These are the results for relative humidity. Again, the results for the day are on top and at night are on the bottom. And during the day, we're seeing lower relative humidity on the south-facing seismic line edge compared to the forest interior. And for the west, or sorry, yes, um, for the east facing edge over at the plot on the right. And we are seeing differences between the wide and narrow lines too. So you'll notice that a lot of the time the differences between edge effects are actually greater at these wider seismic lines compared to the narrow seismic lines. These are the results for regeneration. So now regeneration density represented in stems per hectare is on the y-axis. And we see higher regeneration density on the wide seismic lines as compared to the narrow seismic lines. And this was particularly true for the north-south seismic lines. So here we're seeing greater regeneration. And we can relate that to light. So this is just showing the relationship between average daily light intensity and regeneration density. So where we found the most regeneration was where light intensity was the highest. What we saw there was that line width and orientation affect abiotic factors within that linear disturbance and up to 10 meters into the adjacent forest. Edge effects were most pronounced in those wider seismic lines and at south-facing forest edges. And these findings hopefully provide a better understanding of the abiotic factors influencing plant responses to linear anthropogenic disturbances. And I think they also highlight the importance of trying to design studies very intentionally so that you're collecting data that may help us understand the mechanisms that are driving the vegetation responses. So in this case, we set up transects and collected both microclimate data and regeneration data, but there's so much more we can do. And it's also very difficult sometimes it can be very difficult to find these sites and access these sites. And it takes a lot of time to establish these transects that are perpendicular to the forest edge. So the more data we can collect, as long as we're maintaining high data quality, the better. And when we consider the vegetation at forest edges, we knew this before, but our study really confirmed that edge influence really depends on edge type, the forest type, and the response variable. So both natural and anthropogenic forest edges are dynamic landscape features with unique vegetation attributes. And these edge effects really extend beyond the visible boundary of the forest edge, even at these very, very narrow linear corridors. So that's something to consider when we're thinking about forest management. And if we want to try to minimize those edge effects, then we may want to consider management practices that would kind of promote the forest regrowth, such as in this case, in this photo, they're using restoration practices such as mounding on the seismic lines to try to promote forest regeneration. Or also, if there's a clear cut, we could try, instead of a clear cut, we could use retention harvesting just to try to increase forest recovery faster. So there's a lot of potential for future research. We definitely need studies on both biotic and abiotic variables to try to make those connections between the two. There's potential for many more studies globally, but especially in Africa and Oceania, and at natural edges. So we saw that we're lacking a lot of data at natural forest edges. And there's a need for long-term studies. So repeated sampling would actually be encouraged to see how these forest edges are changing over time. And standardized analyses are encouraged. So there have been a lot of studies. I know Karen's here today. She developed the randomized test of edge influence, but this is, if more researchers were using one standardized method, it would be easier to compare results of studies. More detailed information should definitely be included in publications. After performing the literature review, or while performing the literature review, I was thinking about how much information was lacking. So just more information about the study area, the history of the anthropogenic activities that occurred in the study area, the actual size of the disturbed area that's adjacent to the edge, the age of the edge. This is all very useful information, especially because we know that edges change over time. So it would be really good to include these in the study descriptions when researchers are publishing their research. And with that, I would like to thank the co-authors of the journal articles I presented today. I'd also like to thank the field assistants that collected data in Alberta, as well as the funding agencies that provided financial support. So thank you.